Okay, so in the second part of this lecture, I want to deal with just supply. So what we looked at in the previous part was just the demand curve, and we talked about two things within the demand curve. We talked about movements along the demand curve, which are explained by the law of demand, where the law of demand says that ceteris paribus, changing the price of the good changes the quantity of the good. And we said that there was a causal relationship between the two. So there's a causal reason why changing the one variable moves us along the other axis, right? So again, just as a review, right? We got our quantity demanded of the product, our price of the product, and we moved along this demand curve. But then we also talked about what happens when we relax that ceteris paribus assumption, or what happens when we allow other variables, other than the price of the good itself, to change, like preferences, number of buyers, prices of other goods. Well, what does it do? It doesn't cause a movement along the curve. Rather, it shifts the whole curve. It either decreases it or increases it. And we talked about the particular changes that cause the particular shifts of the curve. So now we want to focus on the supply curve. Okay? So in the supply curve, we're going to talk about the willingness and ability of sellers of the product to supply a particular quantity of the good at a particular price. Again, the supply curve is going to talk about the willingness and ability of sellers to supply a certain quantity of the good at a particular price, at a particular point in time as well. So just like the demand curve then had a long function, the supply curve is going to have the same thing. So what we're going to have here is a supply that is a function of the price of the good itself, the price of related goods, the price of resources, technology, number of sellers. I'm going to make a variable here that's just going to be called the government, and that's going to be things like taxation, subsidies, and it's also going to be government regulations. And then finally, expected prices. Okay, so we're going to have the supply of a good being a function of the price of the good itself, the price of related goods. There's going to be two relationships there again, substitutes and complements. The price of resources used to produce that good, technology, number of sellers, government restrictions, be they either subsidies, taxes, or regulations, and then expected prices. Okay, so just as we had a law of demand, we're also going to have a law of supply. And what the law of supply says is that ceteris paribus, there's going to be now a direct relationship, rather than an inverse relationship like there was for the law of demand. That ceteris paribus, there's a direct relationship between the price of the product and the quantity produced. A direct relationship. So that means that in terms of the P and the Q, that the supply curve is going to be upward sloping. Upward sloping because it's a direct relationship rather than an inverse relationship. Now, this relationship is also causal. It's causal, and in this case, it's actually even easier to see why it's a causal relationship, right? Because as the price of the good increases, firms face an incentive to produce that product. But then also, as firms produce more of a product, one thing we saw from the bowed outward production possibilities frontier, right? Remember that one with the increasing opportunity cost? Is that when it bows outward, that firms face higher costs, right? And if firms face higher costs, right, they're going to need to raise the price in order to maintain the production of that good. So what that would then mean for us, right, is that there's a causal relationship, a causal reason of why changing the price changes the quantity, or changing the quantity changes the price. That was done again saying that ceteris paribus. What happens then when we relax that ceteris paribus assumption? Well, we're going to do that in several ways, right? First thing that we're going to do here is we're going to change the price of related goods. And the first thing that we'll do is the price of a complement in production. Now, what is a complement in production? We said that a complement in consumption, when we talked about the demand curve, were two goods that were used together, right? That was like the phone and the answering machine, right? They're both used in conjunction with one another. Complements in production is basically saying that as we produce one product, we produce as a byproduct the other, right? Not to get graphic here, right? But whenever we make beef, we also make leather, right? The act of killing a cow, right, to get its beef, to get its meat inside of it, right, means that we have its hide, something that we can use to make shoes and belts and fancy car seats, right? Another example would be something like lumber and sawdust, right? So we would have wood to make houses, and then we would have sawdust to give to grade schools when kids throw up in class, or to give to individuals that own guinea pigs or whatever, right? So we're going to have some incentive as a firm, to react to the price of the complementary good, right? Because now if all of a sudden I see that the price of the complement increases, right? The price of leather increases. Well, the only way I can get more leather is by doing what? Supplying more beef, right? Because I have to kill more cows now, right? So because of this, right, as the price of leather is increasing, we know from the law of, in this case, from the law of supply, is that the quantity supplied is going to increase. That's a movement along the supply curve for leather. But it's going to shift the supply curve for beef. Let's look at what that difference entails here. That in the leather market, what I've done here is I've moved along the curve, whereas for beef, I've actually increased the curve. So here was leather, law of supply, moved along the supply curve. Now, as I relax that ceteris paribus assumption for beef, right, as I change the price of this complementary good, what I would see is that the supply of beef is going to increase. It's going to shift out. We could also have the price of a substitute in production. Now this would be, right, we talked about substitutes in consumption being two goods that fulfill a similar need, right? I could have a physical phone, or I could have a cell phone, I could have a really good internet connection. Now here we're talking about substitutes in production. Well, here the best way to understand is that if I have an assembly line to make like SUVs, right, I could probably use that same assembly line to make cars or motorcycles or tanks or planes, right? The assembly line and the workers and the machines I have can probably be used to create a whole variety of products. That would mean that as a firm that has to decide what to produce, I'm going to react to the price of tanks and to small cars, even though I'm a manufacturer of SUVs. Here, right, is that as the price of SUVs increases, right, then I'm clearly going to want to make more SUVs, right? But what is that going to mean about my supply of cars, small cars? It means it's going to fall. And whereas in the top graph, we have a movement along the curve,